In this lesson, we're going to go over the justification defense of self-defense. And specifically, we're really going to focus here on when a person might be justified in using deadly force upon another person. Right, but just to kind of give a really basic example here to illustrate some of the core concepts, we can start with a really straightforward fact pattern. Right, let's say that one day I am giving a lecture to a classroom of law students. Right, and as I'm giving this lecture, there's a student who begins heckling me, right? You know, he's making fun of me throughout the lecture, and towards the end of this lecture, let's say that I get fed up. So I take a piece of paper and I crumple it up right into a ball, and I have a wadded up piece of paper rolled up, and I wind up to throw this ball, this wadded up piece of paper at this student. And as I'm winding up to throw it, let's say this law student really quickly pulls out a gun and shoots me before I can throw the piece of paper at him. Right, and let's say that I die, so this student is charged with murder. Say he gets to court, he gets to trial, and he asserts a self-defense claim. He says, hey, look, you know, I was protecting myself. Michael was about to throw this wadded up piece of paper at me. You know, this could have injured me, this could have caused bodily harm, could have hit me in the eye, right? So I had to protect myself, right? So that's why I shot him, right? So we get this self-defense claim. Why is that self-defense claim, the use of deadly force, right, using a gun to shoot me as I'm winding up to throw a ball of paper at this student, why is this self-defense claim going to be unsuccessful in basically any jurisdiction in the United States? Right, the reason that this is going to be unsuccessful comes down to, and there are several reasons, but one of the more glaring reasons is because of the concept of proportionality. And proportionality is really kind of one of the bedrock concepts of self-defense. And it's one of the first things we should be looking for in any fact pattern, especially where our defendant is using deadly force, like in this example, pulling out a gun and shooting somebody. Right, the idea here is that this wad of paper, right, throwing a balled up piece of paper, it's unlikely that a piece of paper, right, rolled into a ball can cause any type of serious bodily harm or death, right? It's non-deadly force, right? So when I'm throwing a wadded up ball of paper at somebody, I mean, worst case, realistically, is probably like a paper cut, right? It's the definition of non-deadly force. So the defendant is not going to be justified in using deadly force to respond to a threat of non-deadly force. Right, and so this is kind of always step one in the analysis, but it's something we really want to be looking at as we're analyzing self-defense fact patterns. We always want to be aware of proportionality. So in this lesson, we're really going to focus on when the defendant is using deadly force, the type of force that is likely to cause harm or, you know, serious bodily harm or death, right? Things like a gun, using a gun, a knife, a baseball bat, right? Things that are likely to cause serious bodily harm or death, right? Not a wadded up piece of paper. So even though we're really going to focus on the use of deadly force in this lesson, it is important to recognize that the analysis stays relatively similar even if the defendant is using non-deadly force. If we had a fact pattern where the defendant is defending himself with a rolled up piece of paper, right? Or maybe even something more realistic might be pepper spray, right? Or mace. Something that's not likely to kill another human being or cause serious bodily harm, right? It is important to recognize that the analysis will largely stay the same. We just want to make sure that the proportionality is there. So if the defendant is using non-deadly force, all we would really change in our analysis is we change this word right here to non-deadly force. We would say a defendant is justified in using non-deadly force upon another if these first three elements would really stay largely the same. Granted, there is no duty to retreat issue if we're dealing with non-deadly force. So with element 3, if we're thinking about the duty to retreat, that really wouldn't be an issue. So we would note that. But when we get to the fourth element, we would just change this word to non-deadly force, right? Because we always want this proportionality between element 4 and our statement up here at the very beginning of the rule, because this is the bedrock, right? So here, when we're talking about the use of deadly force, we say a defendant is justified in using deadly force upon another, and we go through these elements, and we talk about in element 4, from imminent use of unlawful deadly force by the other party. Right? There has to be that proportionality between the force that the defendant uses and the force that he was threatened with, right? We need that proportionality for the defense to be successful. So if the defendant is using a lower level of force, well, that's going to lower the requirement in element 4, right? So we would just change this word to non-deadly and this word to non-deadly. We don't have to worry about a duty of retreat. Otherwise, the analysis stays mostly the same. So just one introductory comment to make before we jump into this, but most of the fact patterns we're going to see are going to involve the defendant using deadly force. So that's why all the examples we're going to talk about in this lesson, we're really going to talk about situations where the defendant is using deadly force, using a gun, a knife, a baseball bat, something that is likely to cause serious bodily harm or death upon another, okay? But if you saw a fact pattern where the defendant is using non-deadly force, don't panic, right? The only thing that changes is that proportionality idea. So you would just change this to non-deadly force, this to non-deadly force. You don't have to worry about a duty to retreat. Rest of the analysis is largely the same. Okay, with that though, we can jump into it. So how can a defendant successfully assert a self-defense claim when the defendant has used deadly force? When is a defendant justified in using deadly force to protect himself? Well, the first requirement, we say a defendant is justified in using deadly force upon another if the defendant is not the aggressor in the conflict. Right? The gateway issue here is that the defendant cannot be the aggressor in the conflict, right? Whenever we have self-defense fact patterns, the way it typically is going to play out, right, is there's going to be some sort of argument, some sort of conflict, right? Think about our original example. I'm giving a lecture, a student's heckling me, maybe we have some back and forth, there's a little bit of a scuffle, an argument, some sort of fight, a conflict, some type of fray, right? And so eventually I decide to pull out a wadded up piece of paper, and begin threatening the student with this wadded up piece of paper, right? So typically we're going to have some sort of conflict in these types of fact patterns. And in that fact pattern, right, I would be the aggressor, right? It's important to recognize that the difference between the aggressor and the instigator is very important. In this fact pattern where the student is heckling me, right, he might be an instigator, but if he's not using force or a threat of force, he's just using insulting words, right, he's really just an instigator, not an aggressor, right? And it's really important to determine who the aggressor is, because we know the aggressor in the conflict cannot claim self-defense, right? So if I'm the aggressor, right, and something ends up happening and I'm on trial, if I'm the aggressor, I cannot successfully assert a self-defense claim, right? So we always want to identify, and in a conflict, right, someone has to have the status of aggressor, right? And it's going to be the first person in the conflict to use force or a threat of force. So if there's just insulting words being kind of tossed back and forth, right? In most jurisdictions, insulting words alone are not enough to be considered an aggressor. We need to see something with those words along the lines of force or a threat of force, even if it's non-deadly force, right? Taking a balled up piece of paper, right, and beginning to threaten to throw this at somebody, well, that's where we get to a threat of force. Now that person is the aggressor. We know the aggressor cannot claim self-defense if something ends up happening in the conflict. Right now, it is important to recognize that the initial aggressor in a conflict can remove his status as the aggressor and regain the right of self-defense in two major ways. Right, so the status of aggressor can change through a conflict, and it's really important to look at, who has the status of aggressor at the time the criminal act takes place that the defendant is being tried for eventually, right? So The way this works, though, is the first person in a conflict to use force or a threat of force is now the initial aggressor. If a person uses non-deadly force, right? So in our original example, right? Somebody's heckling me, so he's an instigator, but not an aggressor, right? So I'm being instigated, but I'm the aggressor, right? Because I threatened this student with a wadded up piece of paper, right? I threatened to use force against this student, so I'm now the aggressor, right? But because I'm threatening non-deadly force, if this student escalates it from a threat of non-deadly force to deadly force, right? So I threaten the student with a wadded up piece of paper, but he threatens me with a gun. Say he flashes a gun at me and says, "Chill out, Michael, I have a gun." Well, now he takes the status of the aggressor because he's escalated the force from non-deadly force to a threat of deadly force, right? So that escalation actually makes the other side the aggressor, right? So he now loses his right to claim self-defense because he's escalated the situation from a threat of non-deadly force to deadly force. He becomes the aggressor. I lose my status as the aggressor. So that's the first way, right? The second way is if a person threatens to use deadly force, but then they renounce their threat to use deadly force and remove themselves from the conflict, right? Then they actually remove their status as the aggressor and regain their right to claim self-defense, right? So say I threaten the student with a gun, right? I get really upset, he's heckling me, so I take out a gun and threaten the student with a gun. Well, I've just threatened this student with the use of deadly force. So I'm clearly the aggressor. The only way I can remove my status as the aggressor and regain the right of self-defense is if I renounce my threat and remove myself from the conflict. So if I told the student, if I pulled out the gun and was like, stop heckling me, I have a gun, I could hurt you with this gun. And then 2 seconds later, I say, whoa, you know what, I'm sorry. I mean you no harm. I'm going to put this gun away and I'm going to just leave now, right? And then I walk out of the classroom. If I renounce my intent to cause harm, I put the gun away and I walk out of the classroom, and then this student runs out, charges me and tackles me or whatever, right? Well, at that point, once I've renounced my intent to cause harm, I renounce my threat of the use of force. I tell them, look, I'm sorry. I don't want to hurt you. I'm putting the gun away. And then I remove myself from the conflict. I walk out of the classroom. Well, at that point, I've removed my status as the aggressor through renunciation and removal from the conflict. So I can regain the right of self-defense if now I'm attacked. So now, since I lost my status as the aggressor, and then if he comes and attacks me, right, well, I've regained the right to self-defense, right? So those are the two ways the initial aggressor in a conflict can remove his status as the aggressor and regain the right of self-defense. But again, step one, it's always really important to determine in a conflict who is the aggressor. Really important to recognize that there's a difference between an instigator and an aggressor. The aggressor is the first person in a conflict to use force or a threat of force, right? If somebody's just insulting another person, that does not make them an aggressor. If they're just using words, insulting words, in most jurisdictions, words alone are not enough to be an aggressor. It's the first person in a conflict to use force or a threat of force. However, we do know there are two major situations where the initial aggressor in a conflict can remove his status as aggressor and regain the right to claim self-defense. Okay, so this is the first thing we want to go through. Next, we have three more requirements, right? So we say a defendant is justified in using deadly force upon another if the defendant is not the aggressor in the conflict and the defendant reasonably believes that such force is necessary to protect himself from imminent use of unlawful deadly force by the other party. So we can break each one of these down one by one. Thank you so much for watching this video preview of our Legal Education Accelerator Program, or LEAP for short. If you would like to see the conclusion of this video and gain full access to our entire 1L and 2L video library, integrated outlines, streamable audio versions, additional practice exams with explanations, and much more, we invite you to head over to our website and join the thousands of law students who have already enrolled. To get started with your no-risk free trial today, simply click the link in the description box below or visit www.studicata.com